The female billionaire screamed, "Remove him." Then the single dad's engine silenced the entire room. She had built a $9 billion technology company from a single server room and 2 credit cards. She had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times before she was 40. She had survived hostile takeovers, congressional hearings, and a very public divorce that generated more press coverage than most natural disasters. She had never, not once in 22 years of public life, been made to look foolish in front of 200 people in a room she owned. Until the afternoon, Daniel Vasquez walked through her company's demonstration hangar with a battered toolbox and a thermos of coffee, and quietly fixed the one thing that 9 engineers with combined postgraduate credentials totaling 47 years could not. She had screamed the words, "Remove him," in front of everyone. She had said them clearly, loudly, with the full authority of a woman who was used to being obeyed immediately and without question. And then his engine started, and the entire room went silent. And Catherine Merritt, CEO of Merritt Dynamics, one of the most powerful women in American aerospace technology, had to stand there in her own company's building and understand what she had just done. This is the story of what happened next, and of everything that happened before. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this one travels. The Merritt Dynamics demonstration hangar sat on 40 acres of high desert outside Palmdale, California, where the air was dry enough to crack your lips by noon, and the sky was the particular flat white of a place that didn't believe in weather. It was not a beautiful facility. It was a working one. The kind of place where the concrete floor had been stained by decades of hydraulic fluid, and the overhead lighting was industrial fluorescent, and nobody had ever spent money on the lobby, because the people who visited this facility weren't coming to be impressed by the lobby. They were coming to see what the machines could do. Catherine had bought the facility 10 years earlier, when Merritt Dynamics was still a defense subcontractor, specializing in precision guidance systems for unmanned aircraft. She had paid $17 million for it, which at the time represented most of the company's liquid assets, and everyone on her board had told her she was making a catastrophic mistake. She had listened to every single one of them, thanked them for their candor, and signed the purchase agreement anyway. She was like that. She had always been like that. From the time she was 12 years old and told her father that she intended to be an engineer, which in 1987 in a small Ohio town was the kind of announcement that produced a long silence at the dinner table and a certain kind of look from the adults in the room, the look that said, "We love you and we will not say the thing we are thinking." She had seen that look many times in her life. It had never once changed her mind about anything. Her father, Robert Merritt, had been a mechanic, a good one. Not famous, not wealthy, but the kind of man whose reputation traveled through a community the way a good doctor's does, on the specific frequency of trust. He ran a single-bay garage on the edge of town called Merritt's, which had been there since 1971, and which he had inherited from his own father. And the sign above the door was the same sign that had been there when he was a child, painted in blue and white with a torch-wrench graphic that had faded so completely over the decades it was now more suggestion than image. Robert Merritt wore gray work shirts with his name stitched above the left pocket. He kept a Folgers coffee tin on the workbench and refilled it every morning before opening. He smelled like machine oil and the particular brand of hand cleaner that came in the orange pump dispenser. Gojo Natural Orange was the name, and Catherine could still identify it at 20 paces 30 years later. He had large, careful hands. He spoke economically, never using 2 words where one would do, and he had a specific way of listening to an engine that Catherine had spent her entire adult life trying to understand and replicate at industrial scale. He would stand beside a vehicle with his eyes closed. Just stand there, not touching anything, not consulting any diagnostic equipment, just listening. And after 2 minutes or 3 minutes or sometimes 5, he would open his eyes and go directly to the component that was failing, not the component that was showing symptoms, the component that was the actual cause. He was right so reliably that people drove from 2 counties over to have Robert Merritt listen to their engines, and they waited sometimes 2 weeks for an appointment, and they never felt the wait was unreasonable because they knew when he was done, it would be done correctly. "A machine tells you what's wrong," he told Catherine once, sitting at the kitchen table with the smell of dinner still in the air and a cup of Maxwell House coffee going cold beside his left hand. She was 14. She had asked him how he did it, how he always knew. "A machine tells you what's wrong the same way a person tells you. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it." She had written that down in a notebook she still had somewhere. The notebook was a composition book, black and white, the kind you bought at the drugstore for 79 cents in the 1980s. She had written it down because even at 14 she understood that she was in the presence of something that was worth preserving. Robert Merritt died when Catherine was 31, a Tuesday morning in February, a heart attack that the doctor said was fast and that Catherine had decided to believe because the alternative was too specific to be useful. He had been working in the garage when it happened. He was found by his first appointment of the morning, a regular customer named Harold Beatty, who had been bringing his Ford F-150 to Merritt's every 6 months for 11 years, and who called 911 from the garage's landline phone because his cell had no signal, and then sat on the floor beside Robert Merritt for 20 minutes until the ambulance arrived, holding his hand. Which was something Harold Beatty never told anyone, and which Catherine found out about 5 years later from someone else, and which made her cry in her car in a parking garage for longer than she would admit. She had flown back to Ohio. She had buried her father. She had handled the garage, which was more complicated than it should have been and less complicated than she had feared. And then she had come back to California, and she had put her grief in the particular place where very organized people put grief. The place that is not suppression exactly, but is something adjacent, where you fold it neatly and place it on a high shelf and allow yourself to visit it on your own schedule. What she had not done was stop building. Merritt Dynamics had grown in the years after her father died with an intensity that her board members and investors found both impressive and slightly unnerving. She opened 3 new divisions in 18 months. She took the company public. She won 2 Department of Defense contracts that the industry consensus had said were impossible for a company of her size to land. She hired aggressively, paying above market for talent, and she was known in aerospace engineering circles as someone who could identify the best engineer in a room within 10 minutes of walking into it. This last reputation was the thing that made what happened in the demonstration hangar so devastating, not just professionally, personally, because if Catherine Merritt was known for one thing above all others, it was that she saw people clearly. She saw what they were actually capable of, not what they were currently doing, not what their titles said, not what the resume said. She saw the actual thing. She had believed this about herself for 20 years. The demonstration hangar was the day she found out she had been only partially right, and that the partial she'd been missing was the most important part. The Prometheus engine program had been running for 4 years and 8 months when it finally broke in a way that could not be quietly managed. Prometheus was Merritt Dynamics' proprietary hydrogen hybrid propulsion system for medium-range unmanned aerial vehicles, the technology that Catherine had staked the company's next decade on, the thing she had told her board in a closed-door session in March that was going to change everything about how the defense industry thought about sustainable long-distance aerial operations. She had not been exaggerating. The Prometheus specifications, if the engineering team hit their targets, represented a 40% improvement in fuel efficiency over any comparable system currently in production, with a projected range increase that would make every competitor's equivalent platform functionally obsolete. The defense procurement community knew this. 3 government agencies were watching the program. 2 foreign allied governments had expressed formal interest through diplomatic channels. A major aerospace prime contractor had been in quiet acquisition conversations with Catherine's M and A team for 6 months. The stakes, in other words, were not small. The problem was that the Prometheus engine's thermal regulation system had been failing intermittently for 11 months. Not catastrophically, not visibly, not in ways that showed up cleanly on the standard diagnostic arrays. It failed in the particular way that the most serious engineering problems fail, which is quietly and inconsistently, the way a structural flaw expresses itself only under specific load conditions, invisible until the conditions align, and then suddenly, completely present. The engineering team had cycled through 4 complete diagnostic protocols. The lead propulsion engineer, a Johns Hopkins PhD named Dr. Marcus Webb, had personally reviewed every thermal sensor reading from 11 months of test data, and had written a 53-page analysis that was, by any objective measure, a model of technical rigor, and that had not solved the problem. 3 external consultants had been brought in. The first came from MIT's Aerospace Engineering Department. The second had spent 12 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena before moving into private consulting. The third was a German engineer named Hoffman who had worked on the thermal regulation systems of the Eurofighter Typhoon and who was regarded in certain circles as the foremost living expert on the specific class of problem Prometheus was exhibiting. Hoffman spent 3 weeks with the engine. He was methodical, unhurried, and expensive. He consumed a great deal of black coffee and spoke very little, and the Merit Dynamics engineering team found him intimidating in the particular way that genuine expertise is intimidating. Not aggressive, not performative, just quietly absolute, the way a very good surgeon seems absolute in an operating room. When he left, he sent Catherine a report that was 12 pages long, and that concluded with a single sentence that she read 3 times before accepting. The failure is present. Its origin is not where any instrument is currently looking. She had called Hoffman directly. He had told her in his precise, slightly formal English that the system had been modified from its original design specifications during a development phase that predated his involvement, and that the modification had created a diagnostic blind spot. The standard tools were reading what they expected to read. They were missing what had actually changed. He was sorry. He genuinely did not know where to look next. She paid his invoice and thanked him and hung up and sat in her office for 20 minutes looking at the wall. The quarterly review was in 3 weeks. 6 stakeholders from 3 government agencies would be in the Palmdale hangar for a live demonstration. The engine needed to run a clean 30-minute sustained operation test at full specification. It had not successfully completed that test in 11 months. The project budget had absorbed $2,400,000 in diagnostic and consulting costs. The program was 11 months behind the original milestone schedule. The acquisition conversation, which Catherine had not publicly confirmed but had not denied, had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the normal rhythm of quiet that characterized those conversations. Catherine called a full engineering team meeting on a Monday morning and told them, with the flatness of tone that her team had learned meant she was not performing calm but actually achieving it through considerable effort, that the quarterly review would proceed as scheduled. They would have a solution before the demonstration. She did not know what the solution would be. She was confident there was one. Dr. Webb, who had been with Merit Dynamics for 7 years and who had an engineer's respect for honest probability, looked at her across the conference room table and said, "Catherine, we have tried everything we know how to try. Then we need to find someone who knows something we don't," she said, "which means we need to look somewhere we haven't looked." She had not known, standing in that conference room, exactly how literally she would have to take her own advice. Daniel Vasquez had been working for Merit Dynamics Facilities Maintenance Team for 14 months when the quarterly review crisis began. He was on a rotation that covered the demonstration hangar and the adjacent support buildings, which meant he was in and out of the hangar several times a week doing the work that facilities maintenance workers do, the work that is invisible when it is done correctly and only noticed when it is not. Replacing fluorescent tubes, servicing the HVAC units along the eastern wall, checking the emergency lighting battery backups on the monthly schedule that the safety compliance manual required. He was 38 years old. He was 6'1", lean the way people get lean from actual physical work rather than deliberate exercise, with forearms that showed the particular kind of muscle that comes from spending years with tools in your hands. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and he had the kind of face that is hard to place in terms of expression, not unfriendly, but reserved in a way that required time to read correctly. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with 211,000 miles on it, and a crack in the passenger side windshield that he had been intending to replace for 3 months, and kept not getting to, not because he couldn't afford it, but because there were always 9 other things ahead of it on the list. He had a daughter named Rosa. She was 9 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's particular quality of stillness, the ability to be completely focused on something without requiring anyone else to acknowledge that focus. She was in 4th grade at Desert Sands Elementary, which was 14 minutes from the Merit Dynamics facility, and Daniel's schedule was built around that 14 minutes the way a bridge is built around a river. Everything else adjusted to it. Rosa's mother, Alina, had died when Rosa was 2. A car accident on the 14 freeway on a November morning, the kind of accident the news reported in a single sentence and moved on from, which Daniel had found, in the weeks and months that followed, to be one of the stranger facts about grief. How something that rearranges the entire architecture of a life can be contained in a single sentence that a stranger reads while eating breakfast and does not think about again. He had taken Rosa home from his mother-in-law's house, where she had been staying while Alina was in the hospital, and he had sat in his car in the driveway for a very long time before he could make himself go inside. He could not reconstruct the specific duration of that particular sitting. It felt in memory both very long and very brief, the way certain kinds of time do when the mind is doing something too large for ordinary accounting. He had been, before Rosa was born and before Alina died, a propulsion systems engineer. He had worked for a company called Axiom Aerospace Technologies, a mid-size private firm that specialized in advanced propulsion development for both defense and commercial aerospace applications. He had been their senior thermal systems integration engineer on 3 programs, one of which had involved a technology sharing agreement with a European aerospace consortium that resulted in his spending 8 months in Toulouse, France, studying combustion efficiency in hydrogen hybrid systems at a level of technical depth that had been, at the time, genuinely cutting edge. He had been good at it. Not good in the performed way, not good in the way people signal competence in professional settings with the confidence and vocabulary of expertise. Good in the quiet, functional way his father-in-law had called it when Daniel got results nobody else got. You see things differently, his father-in-law had said once, watching Daniel work through a problem at the kitchen table with nothing but a notepad and a pencil. You see the whole thing instead of the part you're looking at. Daniel had left Axiom 6 months after Alina died. He had tried to stay. He had gone back to the office after the bereavement leave was over, and he had sat at his desk, and he had looked at the program documentation on his monitor, and he had understood in a way that was physical rather than intellectual, felt rather than reasoned that he could not do this. Not right now. Not while Rosa was 2 years old and grieving in the way that 2-year-olds grieve, which is without language and without framework, and with a body that kept looking for the person who was supposed to be there. He could not give what that work required and also give what Rosa required. And there was not a version of that calculation where Rosa came second. He had left. He had taken his certifications and his expertise and his years of specialized knowledge, and he had folded them the way you fold something you intend to return to later, carefully, without creasing anything important. And he had put them somewhere in himself that was not gone but was not present either. And he had built a life around Rosa that was, by any measure that actually mattered, a good one. The maintenance work had started as a temporary arrangement. A supervisor he knew from a building he'd lived in for 2 years. A schedule that let him drop Rosa at school and pick her up without depending on anyone else. He had intended it for 6 months, maybe a year. That had been 7 years ago in a different city, before he moved to the Palmdale area to be closer to his mother-in-law, who was Rosa's only other consistent adult, and who needed to be in a radius that allowed for backup pickup on the Tuesdays and Thursdays that Daniel's maintenance rotation ran late. He had been good at maintenance work too, in the same quiet way. His supervisors had consistently given him the most technically complex assignments. When something in the HVAC or the electrical systems required a diagnostic approach rather than a replacement approach, when the problem was the kind that didn't show up cleanly and required someone to understand how the components were interacting rather than just checking each component individually, Daniel got that assignment. He was known, in the specific, wordless way that working teams know things about their members, as the person you called when standard procedures had not found the answer. He had not, in 14 months at Merit Dynamics, told anyone about Axiom. He had not mentioned the Toulouse program. He had not referenced his engineering background in any conversation, not because he was hiding it, but because it had not come up, and because the version of himself that existed in this building wore gray cargo pants and a green company polo and carried a facilities maintenance kit, and the other version had been folded and placed on a shelf 7 years ago and was not this version. He was in the demonstration hangar on a Tuesday afternoon in the week before the quarterly review, replacing 2 fluorescent tubes in the secondary lighting array along the north wall, when he first heard the Prometheus engine running its test sequence. He had heard it before on other days, the particular sound of a hydrogen hybrid system under load, and something in him registered it the way you register a piece of music you once knew very well. Not consciously, not with attention, just a recognition below the level of active thought. But on this Tuesday, he heard it fail. He heard the specific way it failed, and the recognition that moved through him was not below the level of active thought. It was immediate, precise, and arrived with a certainty that he had not felt in a very long time. He finished replacing the fluorescent tubes. He signed out his time card at 4:30. He picked up Rosa from his mother-in-law's house, and they ate tacos from the stand on the corner of 29 Palms, highway that Rosa had decided was the best in California. A claim she made with the empirical confidence of a 9-year-old who has not yet been to all of California, but finds this detail irrelevant. He helped her with her math homework and read 2 chapters of the book she was working through, a fantasy novel about a girl who could speak to desert animals, and he put her to bed at 8:30. Then he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notepad for 2 hours and wrote down what he thought he had heard. The quarterly review was on a Thursday. It began at 9 in the morning. The demonstration hangar had been prepared with the particular thoroughness that high-stakes presentations require, which meant that the floor had been scrubbed. The equipment had been polished to the degree that industrial equipment can be polished, and 3 rows of folding chairs had been arranged facing the Prometheus test platform with the careful symmetry of someone who understood that the arrangement of chairs communicated something about how seriously the presenting party took the event. The 6 stakeholders from the 3 government agencies arrived in 2 vehicles at 8:53. They were greeted by Catherine's head of government relations, a man named Philip Torres who had the practiced warmth of someone who had been managing high-value relationships for 15 years, and who could make small talk about weather patterns in Palmdale with the kind of detailed specificity that made people feel their time was being respected. Catherine met them at the hangar entrance in a charcoal blazer and the kind of composure that looks like ease but requires considerable maintenance. Dr. Webb and his engineering team were already at the test platform. They had been there since 6 in the morning. They had run 3 warm-up sequences on the engine, and they had been successful, which was either encouraging or the particular cruelty of intermittent failures, where the system works until it absolutely matters that it works, and then doesn't, and nobody could say with confidence which category this morning fell into. Daniel arrived at the hangar at 7:45, which was 30 minutes before his scheduled shift start, because he had decided the previous night that he was going to ask to speak to someone on the engineering team before the demonstration began. He had thought about this carefully for 2 days. He had written notes. He had a specific, bounded thing to say, a technical observation that was either going to be useful or wasn't, and the right person to say it to was someone on the engineering team, not facilities management, and the right time was before the demonstration, not during. He spoke to his direct supervisor first, a man named Gary Ockhafer who had been running facilities maintenance at the Palmdale site for 6 years, and who was a fair and competent manager in the specific way that fair and competent managers are rare. He gave people information rather than managed them with it. Daniel told Gary that he had an observation about the Prometheus system that he thought the engineering team should hear before the demonstration. He said it simply without embellishment the way he said most things. Gary looked at him for a moment. "What kind of observation?" he asked. "A technical one," Daniel said. "About the thermal regulation failure, I think I know where the fault origin is." Gary was quiet for 3 seconds. "You think you know where the fault origin is?" he repeated. "Yes." "How?" Daniel told him. Not all of it, not the full background, just the specific technical observation. Gary listened. He was the kind of person who listened without performing listening, which Daniel respected. When Daniel finished, Gary said, "I can't get you in front of the engineering team right now. They're in final prep, but I can take this to Webb directly." He paused. "It might not go anywhere." "I know," Daniel said. "I just think it's worth saying." Gary went to find Webb. Daniel went to the north wall of the hangar to check the fluorescent tube array he had serviced on Tuesday, because that was what his schedule said, and because standing with nothing to do while waiting for something to happen was not how he was built. Webb came back with Gary 20 minutes later. He was a tall man, Webb, with the specific energy of a person who has been awake since 4 in the morning on high cognitive load for 11 consecutive months, and who is managing that condition with professionalism and coffee. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was not dismissive, but was close to it, the expression of someone who has spent 11 months hearing suggestions and finding them insufficient and has developed a defensive calibration around new input. Daniel told him what he had told Gary in the same words in the same register without adding any credential or context that might make it land differently. Just the observation, the specific hypothesis, the location. Webb listened. When Daniel finished, Webb said, "We've been over that integration point twice." "The integration point, yes," Daniel said, "but not the secondary bypass that was added during the 3rd development phase. The bypass reroutes the thermal signal before it reaches the primary sensor array. If the rerouting component is degraded, the primary sensors read clean because they're not seeing the original signal. They're seeing what the bypass is telling them." A silence. Webb looked at him, a different quality of look than before. "How do you know about the 3rd development phase modification?" Webb said. It was not a question with a rising inflection. It was a statement with an investigative quality. I've worked with hydrogen hybrid thermal systems, Daniel said. I recognize the failure signature. Webb looked at him for another moment, then said, let me get the lead diagnostics tech. Can you stay near the platform? I'll be at the north wall, Daniel said. He went back to the north wall. He replaced a second fluorescent tube that didn't actually need replacing yet but was showing early wear indicators in the ballast flicker that he had noted 2 weeks ago. He was still there on a step ladder with the tube housing open when the demonstration began at 9 o'clock. He heard it start. He heard the engine go through its ignition sequence and the first 2 minutes of the sustained operation test, and he heard the sound he had been expecting, the specific frequency shift in the thermal regulation cycle at the 2-minute 40 mark that was the audible signature of the fault he had described to Webb. The engine did not fail catastrophically. It degraded. The power output numbers would be dropping on Webb's monitoring screen right now, consistently and in the pattern that 11 months of test data had been showing, and nobody in the room would know why. He climbed down from the ladder. He picked up his toolbox. He walked toward the test platform. He was 30 feet from the platform when Catherine Merritt saw him. She was standing to the right of the stakeholder group, watching the monitoring screens with the contained expression of a person who is watching numbers go wrong in front of people she needs to impress, and is deciding in real time what to do about it. She registered him the way you register a peripheral thing that doesn't belong in the frame, a maintenance worker with a toolbox walking toward her company's most critical piece of technology during a government demonstration. Stop, she said. Not loudly, not yet, just stop. Daniel stopped. He looked at her. Ms. Merritt, he said, I talked to Dr. Webb this morning about the thermal bypass. I think I can locate the fault. You talked to, she looked at Webb, who was at the monitoring station and who looked back at her with an expression that was complicated enough that she didn't have time to parse it. She looked back at Daniel. She looked at his gray cargo pants and his green polo and his maintenance toolbox, and she made, in the space of approximately 2 seconds, a decision about what she was seeing. Remove him, she said, to Tors, to whoever was nearest. Get him away from the platform. She said it loudly enough that it carried. The 200 people in the room, engineers, support staff, agency representatives, government observers, all of them heard it. Remove him. Said with the full authority of the person who owned the building and the platform and the engine and every person in the room's employment contract. Philip Tors moved toward Daniel. Gary Acaffer had gone very still near the south wall. Dr. Webb had turned from his monitoring station and was watching. Daniel did not move immediately. He looked at Catherine. He said with a quietness that was not submission and not defiance, just plain, the secondary thermal bypass, Ms. Merritt. Behind the primary sensor array, 3rd row, left side of the housing, there is a degraded conductance joint that is sending a clean signal to the primary sensors when the actual thermal load is outside specification. The sensors are reading normal because the bypass is translating the reading before it reaches them. That's why your diagnostics keep coming back clean. The problem isn't where any of your instruments are looking. He said all of it before Tors reached him. Then he stood there, toolbox in hand, and waited. The room was very quiet. Catherine looked at him. She was a person who processed things quickly. She had always been a person who processed things quickly. It was one of her professional assets, and occasionally she understood in this particular moment with a clarity that was slightly like pain, a professional liability. She looked at Webb. Is he describing something real? Webb's voice, when it came, was careful in the way that very honest people's voices are careful when the honest thing is not the comfortable thing. I didn't look at the secondary bypass, he said. It's a development phase addition that's not in the current documentation set. I didn't know it existed. The silence in the room had a specific quality. The quality of 200 people simultaneously recalibrating what they were watching. Catherine looked at Daniel for a long moment. Tors had stopped 2 feet away from him and was waiting for instruction. Gary Acaffer at the south wall had not moved. Let him through, Catherine said. Tors stepped back. Daniel walked to the platform. He set his toolbox down. He opened it, found the tool he needed, a specialized conductance meter that he had brought from home in his lunch bag that morning because it was not a standard facilities kit item. He worked without narration, without the running commentary of a person performing competence, just quietly with complete attention, in the specific deliberate way that competence actually looks when it has nothing to prove. He found the conductance joint in 6 minutes. It was exactly where he had said it was. The degradation was visible once you were looking at it directly. The kind of thing that was completely invisible until you knew what you were looking for, and then was impossible to miss. The way certain things are, the way the shapes hidden in illusion paintings suddenly appear and cannot be unseen. He carried in his toolbox a partial repair kit that he had assembled the previous night at his kitchen table, working from memory, and from the specific axiom-era knowledge, he carried in the part of himself he had folded and put on a shelf, the part that had woken up on Tuesday afternoon in this hangar when he heard that engine fail and had not gone back to sleep since. The repair took 41 minutes. Not because the repair itself was complex, but because he did it correctly, which meant he did not rush the recalibration of the primary sensor array after replacing the conductance joint, and he did not rush the verification sequence, and he did not move forward until each step confirmed what it needed to confirm. The stakeholder group had not left. The government agency representatives sat in their chairs or stood near the monitoring station. Nobody spoke in the particular way that nobody speaks when something is happening that they are trying to understand while it is still happening. Catherine stood to the right of the platform. She did not leave. She did not make calls or check her phone or conduct any of the business she would normally conduct in the presence of downtime. She stood and watched Daniel work with the specific attention of a person who is confronting something they need to understand completely. At 10:51 in the morning, Daniel stepped back from the platform, picked up his conductance meter, and looked at Dr. Webb. "Run the ignition sequence," he said. Webb ran it. The Prometheus engine started. It ran the ignition cycle cleanly, proceeded through the 2-minute 40 transition point without the frequency shift, and continued into the sustained operation test with all output metrics reading precisely at specification. The engine ran for 30 minutes without interruption. All 30 minutes, at full specification without deviation. The room stayed quiet for most of it. The particular quiet of people who had expected failure and were encountering success and needed the time it took to run the test to fully absorb the difference. When the test cycle completed and Webb called out the final metrics, one of the government agency representatives, a woman named Dr. Priscilla Harmon, who had been with the Aerospace Defense Procurement Office for 19 years and who was not known for impulsive responses to anything, began to applaud. Slowly at first. Then the room followed her. Daniel was wiping his hands on a shop rag, his back to most of the room. He did not turn around when the applause started. He finished cleaning the conductance meter, put it in his lunch bag, and began returning his tools to the toolbox in the specific order that he always returned them, because he was a person who put things back where they belonged. Catherine watched him do this. She was not applauding. She was standing very still, with the expression of a person who has just received accurate information about themselves that they were not prepared to receive. She was the one who had screamed, "Remove him," in front of 200 people, in her own hangar, and his engine had silenced the entire room. The stakeholder meeting that followed the demonstration ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time, which Philip Torres managed with the grace of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that genuine success was harder to contain than a scripted one. The government agency representatives asked detailed technical questions that Webb and his team answered with the specific energy of people who had been carrying a weight for 11 months and had just put it down. Dr. Harmon told Catherine privately, in the corridor outside the main conference room, that she was prepared to recommend accelerated procurement evaluation. The acquisition team that had gone quiet called Catherine's cell before she was back in her car. Catherine handled all of it with the competence she always handled things with, the practiced, effective competence of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. She was present. She was articulate. She said the right things and asked the right questions and managed the room the way she always managed rooms. And the entire time, in the specific place where she kept things she was not yet ready to address directly, she was thinking about Daniel Vasquez wiping his hands on a shop rag while the room applauded around him and not turning around. She found Gary Ockhaffer before the stakeholder group had finished their last cup of coffee. She pulled him aside near the hangar's side entrance, in the particular way she had of conducting conversations she wanted privacy for, not aggressive, not secretive, just deliberately removed from the ambient noise of other people's attention. "Tell me about Daniel Vasquez," she said. Gary told her what he knew, which was what a direct supervisor knows, the work quality, the reliability, the specific reputation among the facilities team for the technically complex assignments. He told her about the note he had made twice in the past year, that Daniel was diagnostically capable in a way that went beyond the standard skills set for his role, that he thought about components in terms of system interaction rather than individual function, and that this made him consistently more effective at the unexplained failures that standard protocols didn't catch. "He told me this morning he thought he knew where the fault was," Gary said. "I believed him enough to take it to Webb. I don't always do that. Why did you believe him this morning? Gary was quiet for a moment. Because he wasn't asking for anything when he said it, Gary said. He wasn't trying to get credit or get ahead. He just said what he observed and what he thought it meant, the same way he says everything. He wasn't performing being right. He was just trying to give information that might be useful. Catherine nodded. Where is he now? He signed out at 4:30. He has to pick up his daughter. She knew the broad outline of it by the time she got to her car. Not the details, not the full arc of it. The outline, 14 months on her maintenance team, a daughter, a wife who had died, and something in the professional background that Gary didn't know specifically, but that the morning had made entirely clear. She sat in her car in the parking lot of her own facility for a few minutes before starting the engine. This was not something she normally did. She was a person who moved efficiently from one thing to the next, who found stationary thinking less productive than moving thinking, who had built a company on the principle that forward momentum was almost always better than stillness. She sat there anyway, because the thing she was sitting with required stillness to be examined properly. She had spent 11 months watching some of the best engineers in the aerospace industry fail to find an answer that a man on her maintenance team had found in 2 days. She had screamed, "Remove him," in front of 200 people, including government stakeholders whose opinion she needed, because she had looked at a man in gray cargo pants carrying a toolbox, and her brain had completed the sentence before he had finished saying it. She had believed for 20 years that she saw people clearly, that she did not make the particular mistake of assigning capability based on presentation. She had said this in interviews. She had built her hiring philosophy around it. She had trained her managers with it as a principle. And she had looked at Daniel Vasquez and seen a maintenance worker who needed to be removed from her platform, and she had been completely, specifically, publicly wrong. The question she was sitting with was not a comfortable one. It was, how many others in 14 months? In 22 years, how many Daniel Vasquezes had she walked past or through on the way to the people she had decided were the right people to look at? She started the car. She had a dinner to get to. She had 4 messages to return. She had the kind of evening that a company CEO in the middle of a pivotal program demonstration has, full and demanding and surrounded by people who needed things from her. She drove, and the question came with her. She asked her head of human resources to pull Daniel's employment file on Friday morning. Not his personnel record, his full file including his application documentation and anything he had submitted with it. She read it at her desk with the same attention she gave to the technical reports that came through her office, which was complete. His application for the facility's maintenance position had been submitted 14 months earlier through the company's standard online portal. The application listed his work history correctly, facilities maintenance at 2 previous companies over the preceding 6 years, and before that a line that said propulsion systems engineering, Axiom Aerospace Technologies, 2010 to 2017, senior thermal systems integration. It listed his degree, a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from Cal Poly Pomona, with a minor in Applied Thermodynamics. It listed in the skills section, in plain language with no particular emphasis, expertise in hydrogen hybrid propulsion thermal regulation systems and integrated systems diagnostics. The application had been processed by the HR intake team. It had been routed to facilities maintenance. It had never been seen by anyone in the engineering division. She read that last sentence twice. She read the skills section again. Expertise in hydrogen hybrid propulsion thermal regulation systems. It was there. It had been there since the day he applied, in plain language, processed by intake, routed to facilities, and never seen by anyone who would have understood what it meant. She called her HR director, a woman named Sandra Obi who had been with Merit Dynamics for 8 years, and who was both good at her job and the kind of person who received difficult information without becoming defensive about it, which was a combination Catherine valued and tried to build for. His application listed his engineering background, Catherine said without preamble. Yes, Sandra said, after a brief pause that indicated she had already pulled the file and was ahead of the question. It was never flagged for the engineering division. No, another pause. He applied for a facilities maintenance position. The intake process routes applications to the hiring manager for the position applied for. There's no mechanism for cross-referencing skills in a maintenance application against open roles in technical divisions. We don't have that mechanism, Catherine said. We don't have that mechanism, Sandra confirmed. The conversation that followed was not recriminatory. It was not a discussion about what had gone wrong. It was, from almost the first exchange, a conversation about what to build. Because that was the way Catherine Merritt processed hard information. Not, well, this means this failed and we must assign blame, but rather clearly, this means there is a gap, and gaps are problems, and problems have solutions, and finding the solution is the only useful response to the problem. But before the conversation about what to build, there was the conversation she needed to have with Daniel. She had Gary ask him to come to her office on Monday morning, not through a formal HR channel. Through Gary, the way you ask a person to come see you when you want the message to carry a human weight rather than an institutional one. Tell him it's not a problem, she said to Gary. Tell him I want to talk, that's all. Gary passed it on. Daniel came on Monday at 9. He arrived in his work uniform, gray cargo pants and green polo, which she had half expected. He carried nothing. He stood in her office doorway for a moment the way people who are not accustomed to executive offices stand in them, not intimidated, just orienting, taking in the room with a look that assessed without performing assessment. Come in, she said. Sit down. He sat. He did not do the thing that most people do when they sit across from someone with significantly more institutional power, the thing where you adjust your posture or your expression to signal that you understand the power differential and are not threatening it. He just sat, with the same quality of presence he seemed to carry everywhere, complete but undemonstrative. I owe you an apology, Catherine said. She said it first before anything else because she had decided that was the right order. Not context first, not explanation first. The apology first. He looked at her. He did not say it's all right or anything that would have moved past the apology before it had been fully received. He just waited for the rest of it. What I said in the hangar was wrong, she said. Remove him. I said it because I looked at you and I made a decision about what I was seeing that had nothing to do with what you actually were. I made it in 2 seconds and I made it in front of 200 people and I was wrong and I am sorry. A silence. Thank you, Daniel said, simply without caveats. He said it the way he said everything, as though the words meant what they meant and didn't need to be dressed up. I read your application file this week, she said. Your background is in your application, your engineering background, your Axiom experience, the thermal systems work. It was all there. Yes, he said. We have no mechanism in our intake process to route that kind of background from a maintenance application to the engineering division, she said. That's a problem in our system. It's not a comment on you. It's a failure on our side. He nodded, not in a way that was forgiving the institution or clearing the institution of responsibility, just acknowledging the factual statement. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Why maintenance work, not why you left engineering? I think I understand that. Why specifically maintenance work? He was quiet for a moment. The thinking quiet, not the evasion quiet. I needed control over my schedule, he said. After Alina died, Rosa was too. She needed consistency in a way that was physical, not just emotional. The same time every morning, the same time every afternoon. Reliable. When I was at Axiom, the work required the opposite of that. Long test cycles, late calls, travel. I couldn't be what the work needed and also be what Rosa needed at the same time. And there was no version of that calculation where Rosa came second. He said it without apology, without the particular self-consciousness people have when they explain a choice that looks from the outside like they gave something up. He wasn't performing the sacrifice. He was just describing what happened. Maintenance work let me control my morning and my afternoon, he said. Everything else I could figure out. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. She was 46 years old. She had been evaluating engineers and executives and candidates of every kind for 20 years. She had sat across from people who were trying to present themselves to her advantage and people who were genuinely being themselves, and she had developed over those 20 years a calibration for the difference that she trusted. She trusted it now. I want to offer you a position, she said. A real one. In the engineering division. He did not respond immediately. She waited because she had learned in this conversation that his pauses were not absence, they were thought. I've been out of the field for 7 years, he said. My certification's lapsed. I'd need recertification. I know, we'd fund it. It would take time, I won't rush it. I'm not asking you to rush it. He looked at the window on the east side of her office, which faced the test facility complex, and beyond it the flat, high desert going toward the mountains. I need to talk to Rosa, he said. She had expected this. She was not surprised by it. But there was something about the plainness of it, the complete absence of any embarrassment about the fact that a 9-year-old's opinion had direct veto power over his professional decisions. That made her pause in a way that was not about the practicality of the situation. Of course, she said. And I need the schedule in writing, he said. Not a general commitment to flexibility, specific hours in the contract. Drop-off time in the morning, pick-up time in the afternoon. Any modification requires my agreement and compensatory time, not money. He was looking at her directly when he said this, and there was something in the look that was neither aggressive nor soft. It was simply the look of a person who had learned, through specific experience, exactly what he needed and exactly what happened when he didn't get it stated clearly in advance. "Done," she said. "I need a week," he said. "Take two." He nodded. He stood up from the chair the way he stood up from things, functional, no ceremony, no performance of the moment's weight. At the door, he stopped. "What you said in the hangar," he said, not turning around. "I know what it was, I'm not carrying it." She looked at the back of him for a moment. The green polo, the gray pants, the worn work boots that had been in this building for 14 months doing exactly what they said they would do when he applied for the job. "Thank you," she said. "That's more than I deserved." He left. She turned back to her desk. The morning light had come all the way through the east-facing window and was reaching the near edge of the floor, and she noticed it in the particular way you notice something ordinary, as if for the first time when your perception has been recalibrated by something adjacent to it. Rosa Vasquez heard about the Prometheus demonstration the way 9-year-olds hear about adult events, which is in pieces, through a filter of other concerns, while eating an after-school snack and thinking about something else simultaneously. Daniel told her on the Friday evening after the Thursday demonstration, sitting at the kitchen table with chips from a bag of Xochitl tortilla chips between them, which Rosa had decided was the only acceptable chip, and which Daniel bought from the grocery outlet on 29 Palms Highway because it was the location that carried them in the large bags. He told her the simplified version. He had fixed something at work that other engineers hadn't been able to fix. The woman who ran the company had offered him a different job, an engineering job. Rosa listened while eating chips. She had her father's quality of attention, complete and visible without being demonstrative. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. The first question was whether the job would mean he couldn't pick her up from school anymore. He told her the pickup was going in the contract. She nodded. The second question was whether the job was something he actually wanted to do or something he thought he should do. He looked at her for a moment, because it was a more precise question than he had been expecting, and he said both. He said both things were true, the wanting and the feeling of should, and they weren't in contradiction with each other, and she should know that was a normal way to feel about a big change. She considered this, chewing a chip with the focused deliberation of a person taking a philosophical position seriously. Then she said it sounded right to her. The third question was whether the woman who ran the company was nice. Daniel paused. "She was honest," he said. Rosa seemed to find this satisfactory. She ate another chip. She said she was going to ask Mrs. Castillo, her 4th-grade teacher, whether fixing something nobody else could fix counted as a science achievement, because she was keeping a list of their family's science achievements in a notebook she had started over the summer, and this seemed like it should be on the list. Daniel told her he thought that was a very reasonable classification. She went to do her homework. He sat at the kitchen table with the Xochitl chips and his coffee and the quiet of the apartment in the late afternoon. The particular quiet of a place where a child is doing something in the next room, not silent but occupied, and thought about what it meant to be standing at the edge of a version of himself he had put down 7 years ago. He had not missed it the way he had expected to miss it. That was the thing he had not anticipated when he left Axiom, that grief had a way of reorganizing what you thought mattered, of changing the resolution on your own desires so that things you had been certain were essential became simply optional, and things you had barely registered became necessary. He had expected to feel the loss of the engineering work like an amputation. Instead, he had felt it like a door closing in a house with many rooms, audible, definite, but not the whole house. He had not been in that room for 7 years. He had stood outside it sometimes, heard what he thought were sounds from inside it, recognized things in passing that belonged to it. The Tuesday he had heard the Prometheus engine fail was the day the door had opened on its own, and he had stood on the threshold for 2 days, and on Thursday morning in the hangar he had walked through it. The question was whether walking back through it would mean losing something else. He did not think it would. The schedule would be in the contract. The mornings and the afternoons would be the mornings and the afternoons. Rosa would still be the architecture around which everything else organized itself. But big changes carry their own uncertainty, and the uncertainty is real, and the honest answer to Rosa's second question had been exactly what he had given her. Both, the wanting and the should, not in contradiction, just both. He called Catherine's office on Wednesday. He told her assistant he'd like to leave a message. The message was he'd take the offer, the contract terms they'd discussed. He needed the recertification to proceed at his pace, and he was thinking 3 to 4 months before he formally transitioned out of maintenance and into the engineering role because he wanted to do it right rather than fast. Catherine called him back herself, not her assistant, within 40 minutes. 3 to 4 months is fine, she said. Everything you outlined on Monday is in the contract draft. I'm having it sent to you today. Thank you, he said, a brief pause. Rose is okay with it, she asked. She asked if you were nice, he said. I told her you were honest. He could hear something in the silence on the other end, not quite a laugh, but what a laugh leaves behind when it has just barely not happened. That's generous, Catherine said. It's accurate, he said, and hung up. The story got out 9 days after the demonstration. Not through a press release, not through any managed channel, not because anyone at Merit Dynamics had made a decision to share it. It got out because Dr. Priscilla Harmon, at a procurement conference in Washington, D.C., mentioned in a conversation with a defense industry journalist that she had witnessed something remarkable in a Palmdale hangar. And the journalist, whose name was Kevin Park and who had been covering aerospace procurement for 11 years, and had the instincts of a person who recognizes the edge of a story before he has seen the full shape of it, asked 2 follow-up questions. By the time the procurement conference ended, Kevin Park had enough to write a first draft. The piece ran on a Monday in a defense technology publication called Payload, which had 40,000 industry subscribers and a social media following that was small but of a specific kind, the kind where each follower had a reach that multiplied the story's velocity in ways that raw follower counts didn't capture. By Tuesday afternoon, the story had been picked up by 3 business publications. By Wednesday morning, it was in the general news cycle. The headline that ran in the most widely distributed version in a business news outlet with a significant general audience was, "Billionaire CEO told maintenance worker to leave. He fixed the engine instead." It was not entirely fair. It was not entirely unfair. It was what headlines are, a reduction to the most structurally satisfying version of a true thing, the version that carries on a single sentence the weight of everything the reader wants to understand before they decide whether to read further. Catherine had been in the public narrative long enough to know this. It did not make it more comfortable to read. By Thursday, 3 things had happened that required her to make decisions. The first was that Daniel had texted her, not called, texted, which she had registered without analyzing it as a communication style preference, saying simply that a journalist from a business magazine had found his address somehow and sent a physical letter. He wanted to know if she had a communications person who could advise him on how to handle it. She had Andrea Ruiz, her communications director, call him within the hour. Not because Catherine told her to, because she texted the message to Andrea and added, "Call him yourself, not your assistant." Andrea, who had been managing Catherine's public narrative for 6 years and who had learned to read the specific weight of different varieties of directive, called Daniel personally. The second thing was that Rosa's teacher, Mrs. Castillo, called Daniel to say that Rosa had a wonderful morning because 3 of her classmates had told her they had seen her father's name on the internet. And Rosa had spent 20 minutes at lunch explaining the engineering details to them with a level of technical accuracy that Mrs. Castillo found impressive, and that the other 9-year-olds found either interesting or confusing depending on their individual relationship with thermodynamics. Daniel told Catherine about this at the Monday morning meeting they had scheduled to go over the contract final draft. He told it as a story, not as an emotional report, with the precise, slightly dry quality of a person recounting a fact that they find both funny and faintly alarming. Catherine listened and found herself unexpectedly moved in a way that she did not immediately explain to herself, by the image of a 9-year-old girl explaining thermal bypass conductance degradation to her 4th-grade classmates during lunch. The third thing was that Axiom Aerospace Technologies issued a public statement on their LinkedIn page expressing pride in Daniel's achievement and noting that he had been a valued member of their team and remained an outstanding representative of the kind of talent they sought to attract. The statement had been written, the internet had immediately and correctly identified, by someone in corporate communications who had not known Daniel personally, because it included the phrase highly motivated self-starter, which was not a phrase anyone who had actually met Daniel Vasquez would use to describe him. The internet's response to the Axiom statement was, in Catherine's communications director's phrase, not warm. The prevailing sentiment was that a company which had benefited from Daniel's 7 years of specialized development work and had then watched him leave without, as far as anyone could tell from the public record, any significant attempt to retain him given his specific family circumstances, had not earned the right to a retroactive celebration of his talent. This was a sentiment Catherine had privately which she did not share publicly, because she understood that she occupied a position in this story that required a certain precision of public statement, and that position was, "I made a mistake, I am correcting it. The correction is real." She gave one interview. She chose Kevin Park because he had broken the original story and because she had read his 11 years of coverage and trusted his precision. She met him at the Palmdale facility because she wanted the conversation to happen in the place where the thing had happened rather than in the neutral territory of a conference room somewhere else. She told him the truth. All of it, the remove him, the application that had been routed correctly by an intake system that had no mechanism to cross-reference skills across divisions. The 11 months of expensive expert consultation that had not found what a member of her own maintenance staff had found in 2 days. She did not manage the narrative into a shape that was more comfortable. She said what had happened and what she was doing about it. Kevin Park asked her at the end of the interview what she would say to the other Daniel Vasquezes, the ones still on maintenance teams and logistics teams and support staff desks at companies like hers who had folded something important about themselves and put it on a shelf because life had required it and who had not had a moment like Thursday's demonstration to create the opening. She was quiet for a moment. "I'd say that the failure is on us," she said. "The companies, the institutions. We built intake processes that see the job someone is applying for and not the person applying. We built organizational structures where skills in a maintenance application never reach a desk where someone can understand what those skills mean. We decided to look in the places we already knew to look, and we stopped before we got to the people in the building." She paused. "That's correctable," she said. "But only if you decide it's worth correcting and then actually do it, rather than running a press cycle about doing it and going back to the same system on Monday morning." Kevin Park wrote that down. The last line became the closing paragraph of his follow-up piece, which ran the following week and which was read more widely than the first one. The initiative Catherine launched 4 months after the demonstration was called the Whole Application Program, a name that was deliberately functional rather than branded, because she had been in this industry long enough to know that branded initiatives with inspirational names tended to generate press releases and then slowly disappear when the next operational priority arrived. She wanted something that sounded like a process because she wanted it to survive as one. The mechanics were straightforward. All applications submitted through Merit Dynamics' hiring portal, regardless of the position applied for, were cross-referenced against a competency matrix that covered every technical discipline present in the company. An application for a facilities maintenance position was checked against the same matrix as an application for a senior propulsion engineer role. If the background listed in any application contained expertise in a technical area that was relevant to an existing or open engineering role, the application was automatically flagged for secondary review by a human recruiter with the appropriate technical background, not to redirect the applicant away from the job they had applied for, but to initiate a separate conversation about whether there was an additional opportunity. The program extended to current employees. A voluntary skills disclosure survey was sent to every non-technical employee in the company, from facilities maintenance to logistics to administrative support to security, asking them to list any technical training, education, certifications, or professional experience they held outside their current role. The survey was anonymous in its initial phase, meaning the results were reviewed without individual identification, and employees who wished to discuss their backgrounds further could opt into a follow-up conversation with HR. The results of the first survey, sent to 214 non-technical employees, came back over 3 weeks. Sandra Obi presented them to Catherine in a meeting that lasted 90 minutes and that Catherine had requested no one else attend. 37 employees had backgrounds, credentials, or professional experience in technical fields relevant to Merit Dynamics engineering operations. Not adjacent fields, not loosely related experience, directly relevant expertise. Among them were a logistics coordinator who had spent 6 years as a licensed avionics technician before a health crisis forced him to take a lower demand role. A security officer at the facility gate who held a master's degree in materials engineering from Arizona State and had published 2 papers in a peer-reviewed journal before leaving academic research to be closer to her family. A cleaning crew team leader at the company's San Diego office who had been, before immigrating to the United States, a mechanical engineer working on commercial aircraft maintenance in her home country, whose credentials had not transferred through the U.S. credentialing process, and who had been unable to afford the recertification while supporting 3 children, but who had continued studying on her own time and who, when asked by the HR follow-up to describe her current technical knowledge level, wrote 3 paragraphs of precise, fluent, correct aerospace engineering that made Sandra Obi sit back in her chair and put the paper down for a moment. Catherine sat across the conference table from that presentation and did not speak for almost a full minute. 37 people, she said. In a company of approximately 1,800 employees, Sandra said. In the non-technical staff population of 214, that's a 17% incidence rate. 17%. If the incidence rate is representative across our full employee population, Sandra began. It won't be exactly representative, but it won't be zero either, Catherine said. 300 people minimum, Sandra nodded. Build the full remediation pathway, Catherine said. Not just the conversation, the whole pathway, credentialing support, schedule accommodation, transition plans, do it properly. I want it in operations by the first quarter. Sandra had the expression of someone who had been waiting to be told to build this for a while. I have a draft, she said. I started it after the Vasquez file. Good, Catherine said. That's good. He transitioned formally into the engineering division on a Monday in late spring, 4 months after the demonstration, 3 weeks after his recertification was complete. He had done the recertification through a Professional Engineering Institute's accelerated program that Merit Dynamics had funded, working through it on evenings after Rosa went to bed, and on Saturday mornings when she was at her soccer games, which she played with the same quality of focused intensity her father brought to most things, a fact observed and documented by 3 separate coaches who had used 3 variations of the same phrase. She doesn't make noise about it, she just does it. His first assigned project was a thermal efficiency audit of the Prometheus engine's secondary systems now that the primary fault had been repaired, which Catherine had assigned specifically and deliberately because it was the right project for his specific expertise, and because starting him anywhere else would have been a waste of the precise knowledge that had made his presence in the hangar valuable. She was done with waste. He had a workspace in the engineering wing of the demonstration facility, a room with a long worktable and the kind of sustained natural light that the desert produces in the late morning, flat and clean, and without the softening effect of humidity. There was a whiteboard along one wall. He had covered most of it by the second day, not with the polished diagrams of a person performing expertise, but with the kind of working notes that show a mind thinking in real time, arrows and brackets and provisional labels that got crossed out and replaced, the physical record of someone tracking a complex system across all of its interactions simultaneously. Dr. Webb, who had spent 11 months looking for the fault that Daniel had found in 2 days, had had 3 weeks to decide how he felt about that. He had decided, with the intellectual honesty that was the best thing about him as an engineer and as a person, that what he felt was grateful. He had been looking at the problem the way his training had told him to look at it, with the tools his training had given him, in the locations his diagnostic protocols pointed to. Daniel had looked at it differently because he had come to the problem from a different angle, with a specific experiential knowledge that the standard training had not covered and the standard protocols had not anticipated. That was not a failure of methodology. It was a gap in the methodology's range, and the way to close the gap was to have Daniel in the room. Webb walked into Daniel's workspace on the 3rd day with 2 cups of coffee from the facility's break room, the specific gesture of someone who has decided to begin a working relationship in a particular register rather than allowing it to develop by default. He set 1 cup on the work table and said, "Tell me how you knew to look at the bypass." Daniel looked at him. He picked up the coffee. "I worked on a hydrogen hybrid system in Toulouse in 2014 that had a similar fault," he said. "Different aircraft, different application, but the thermal bypass was the same component class. When I heard the Prometheus failure signature on Tuesday, I recognized the frequency pattern. It's the specific degradation sound that class of component makes when the conductance joint is compromised." He paused. "It's not in any diagnostic manual. You'd only know it if you'd heard it before." Webb was quiet for a moment. "And you heard it in a maintenance shift while replacing a fluorescent tube." "I heard it from 60 feet away while on a step ladder," Daniel said. "The acoustics in the hangar are good." Webb looked at the whiteboard for a moment. "I'm going to need you to teach me what that sounds like," he said, "and anything else you know that isn't in a manual." "I know a few things," Daniel said. The working relationship that developed from that conversation was, by the end of the first quarter, the most productive that Merit Dynamics propulsion engineering team had produced in 4 years. Not because Daniel was superior to Webb, but because the combination of Webb's systematic methodology and Daniel's experiential pattern recognition produced a diagnostic approach that was comprehensively better than either alone. They argued productively in the specific way that people argue when they are both fully committed to finding the right answer and neither is attached to being the one who finds it. They filled whiteboards. They disagreed about intermediate conclusions and agreed about final ones. They were, by the measure that matters in engineering, which is the measure of what the machines do at the end of the day, exceptionally effective together. Rosa came to the facility once, on a Saturday when Daniel had a makeup test session for his recertification program, and she had no soccer game. She sat in his workspace with her notebook and her pencil case, which contained a Staedtler Mars plastic eraser, 2 Pentel Graph Gear 1000 mechanical pencils, and a set of fine-tip Staedtler Triplus fineliner pens in 8 colors that she used for her science achievement notebook. Because, as she had explained to her father on the occasion of purchasing them at Target, color coding made the data more accessible. She looked at the whiteboard while Daniel was with the recertification instructor in the adjacent room. When he came back, she was standing in front of it, hands clasped behind her back, looking at it with the expression he recognized as her deepest concentration face, the one where the rest of her face went still and only her eyes moved. "Is this the engine that was broken?" she asked. "These are the thermal regulation systems," he said. "The part that was broken is in the lower left diagram." She looked at the lower left diagram. "The junction box with the arrow to the sensor group," she said. "The conductance joint in the bypass line," he said. "That green bracket." She nodded slowly with the consideration of someone taking information in rather than processing it for a response. "Is it fixed now?" "Yes." "Is the rest of the engine okay?" "That's what I'm checking." She nodded again. She went back to her notebook. She added something in the science achievement section in blue fineliner. He could see from his angle that she wrote his name, and then, in parentheses, found the fault in the thermal bypass, which was, he thought, a reasonably accurate description. The Prometheus program was formally presented to the defense procurement community in the fall, 7 months after the quarterly review demonstration. The presentation went the way presentations go when the underlying technology is genuinely sound, and the people delivering it have spent 9 months making it sounder. Dr. Harmon's recommendation had led to an accelerated evaluation that concluded with a formal letter of intent from 2 agencies. The acquisition conversation, which had been quiet for 4 months, was not quiet anymore. Catherine was in her car in the facility parking lot after the fall presentation, sitting with the engine off in the particular way she had been sitting in parking lots more often since September, which was without any agenda other than giving a large thing the physical stillness it seemed to require before she could carry it correctly. She thought about the cover of Forbes. The 3 times, the profile photos, the captions that described her as someone who could see talent that others missed, as someone who hired against the grain, as someone who built companies by looking where other people weren't looking. She thought about 37 people. She thought about the logistics coordinator who had been an avionics technician, who had come forward in Sandra's survey, and who was now in a transition program toward a propulsion system support role, working evenings and weekends on the recertification that the company was funding. Studying from Jeppesen maintenance manuals and transport category aircraft systems textbooks that he ordered from the ATP aviation store online, and that were stacked on his kitchen table at home every night after his kids went to bed. She thought about the materials engineering master's degree on the security desk at the facility gate, about the 3 paragraphs of precise aerospace engineering that a cleaning crew team leader had written in response to a voluntary survey. She thought about her father, Robert Merritt, in his gray work shirt with the torch wrench sign going white above the door and the Folgers coffee tin on the workbench, and the way he would stand beside an engine with his eyes closed, hands quiet at his sides, listening. The thing he had told her about machines telling you what was wrong the same way people did, if you stopped talking long enough to hear it. She had built a very large, very effective machine for not stopping. For moving forward, for processing, for being the person who saw things and acted on them and made decisions, and maintained the momentum that the machine of a major company required. She had been proud of that. She was still proud of it because the forward movement was real and it had produced real things. But what she understood now, sitting in the parking lot in October with the desert going dark around her, was that the machine had a blind spot built into its design, and that the blind spot was structural, not personal. She had not failed to see Daniel Vasquez because she was incapable of seeing him. She had failed to see him because she had built or inherited or participated in building a set of structures that organized what she looked at in advance of her looking. The intake process. The divisional routing. The implicit taxonomy that sorted people into categories before anyone with the right expertise had read their application. She was good at seeing people who had already been placed in front of her correctly. She was not good, she had not been good, at seeing the people who were placed in front of her incorrectly. And the people placed in front of her incorrectly were the ones who had made the compromises that life requires, who had traded one version of themselves for a more necessary version, who were walking the corridors of her company and fixing the lights and signing the time cards and carrying, quietly, folded carefully, the version of themselves that had not yet been asked to come back out. She had told Kevin Park that the correction was correctable. She had meant it. The whole application program was real. The 37 people were in various stages of a process that would either return them to work that matched what they knew or would give them the resources to reach work that matched what they knew. That was real. But what she was sitting with in the parking lot was the question that went past the program. The question of what it required of her, personally, day to day, to become the person she had told Forbes she was. Not in the headline version, in the operational version. The version that stood in a hangar at 9 in the morning with 200 people watching and saw a man in gray cargo pants walking toward her platform and did not, in 2 seconds, close the sentence. She did not know if she would get there. She thought she probably would not get there completely, because the structures she was working against were not only external, and the ones that were internal had been built over a long time and were good at being invisible to the person who had built them. But she knew more than she had known in September, and knowing more than you knew before is not nothing. It is, in fact, exactly where everything that matters begins. Daniel took Rosa to Palmdale's prime taco spot, Juanito's on Rancho Vista Boulevard, on the evening of the day he officially transitioned into the engineering division. It was a Tuesday, which was Rosa's preference for tacos, because she had decided that Tuesday tacos were categorically better than weekend tacos for reasons she had explained once at length, and that Daniel had not fully followed, but had accepted as settled policy. They ordered at the counter, carnitas for him, al pastor for her, agua fresca in the cups with the plastic lids that Rosa liked because you could watch the color of the drink through the cup. And they sat at one of the outdoor tables under the awning with the evening coming in warm off the desert, and the Palmdale streets doing their Tuesday evening thing around them, ordinary and continuous and unmoved by the significance of the day. Rosa ate her first taco in the focused silence she brought to things she was serious about. Then she said, without looking up from the second taco she was assembling, "Is it what you thought it would be, going back?" He thought about it. He ate a bite of his own taco. "Different," he said. "Different how?" "I'm different," he said. "I know more things, not just engineering things, other things. I see the work differently than I did before. There's more of it that I can see." He paused, finding the right words, the specific ones that would be honest with a 9-year-old without being abstract. "When I was doing this work before, I was good at the technical part, but I didn't have as much patience for the parts that weren't technical. The communication, the waiting, the parts where you have to convince other people that what you're seeing is real. I was impatient with those parts. And now?" she asked. "Now I know that those parts are actually the hardest parts," he said. "And I'm better at them." He looked at her. "I'm better at them because of you, because I spent 7 years explaining things to someone who was honest about when the explanation didn't work and who asked the right question when I was getting it wrong." She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression she had when she was deciding whether something was a compliment or a fact. She decided it was a fact. "You explained a lot of things wrong at first," she said. "I know. The volcano one especially. The volcano explanation was a bad explanation. I stand by that." She finished her second taco. She drank her agua fresca. She looked at the street for a while in the comfortable way she had of sitting in silence, the quality that was his, not performed or self-conscious, just present. "Mom would think this is funny," she said eventually, not sad, just observational. "Yeah," he said, "she would. She would say you should have fixed that engine years ago and stopped changing light bulbs." "She would have said that," he agreed. "She also would have said the schedule going in the contract was smart. She was always smarter about contracts than I was." Rosa nodded, satisfied, and reached for the chips that came with the order, the Tostitos Cantina-style chips in the basket that Juanito's always put on the table, which Rosa rated as inferior to Xochitl but acceptable in a restaurant context. He looked at her across the table. The outdoor light was that particular shade of desert evening, going gold at the edges, not quite dark. She had her mother's eyes and his stillness and her own particular quality that was neither of theirs, the one she had built herself out of the specific circumstances of her own life, which had included loss early and a father who was present and a grandmother who was present and a fourth-grade teacher who was strict about math homework, and a notebook she kept of science achievements, and a very strong opinion about tortilla chips. She was, by any measure, entirely herself. And she was, by his specific and not objective measure, the best thing he had made. He thought about the parking lot behind the hospital 7 years ago, the sitting, the time that could not be measured correctly. He thought about the apartment he had come home to with a 2-year-old who was looking for someone who was not there, and the long, unglamorous, unwitnessed work of the years after that, the mornings and the afternoons and the fluorescent tubes and the maintenance routes and the folded version of himself on the shelf, patient and present, waiting. He thought about a Tuesday afternoon in a Palmdale hangar when he had heard an engine fail at 60 feet, and something in him had woken up. He thought about 41 minutes at a test platform in front of 200 people, and a conductance meter from his lunch bag, and the sound the engine made when it ran cleanly for the first time in 11 months. He thought about the Forbes profile on the wall of Catherine Merritt's office that talked about seeing talent others missed, and the moment in the hangar when she had not seen him, and the moment in her office when she had said, "I was wrong and I am sorry," without preface or management, and the space between those two moments, which was the most important distance in the story. Because that was the thing about people who actually change. The distance between who they were and who they become is always the real story, not the achievement that catalyzed it. The achievement is the surface. The distance is what's underneath. Catherine Merritt had screamed, "Remove him," in front of 200 people, and then had stood in a parking lot 4 months later and asked herself the hardest version of the question the hangar had raised. Daniel Vasquez had spent 7 years carrying a folded version of himself and had picked it up again, and found it heavier and lighter than he remembered simultaneously. The way true things feel when you return to them after long enough. And Rosa Vasquez had sat at a table in a demonstration facility with Steitler fineliner pens and written her father's name in her science achievement notebook next to the words "found the fault in the thermal bypass," because she was 9 years old and she kept records of important things, and this was an important thing, and she was not wrong. The desert evening came fully in. The Palmdale streets continued their Tuesday business. At Juanito's on Rancho Vista Boulevard, a father and his daughter finished their tacos and argued briefly about the chip situation, and agreed that the agua fresca had been the right choice, and eventually gathered their things and walked to the truck, the 2009 Ford F-150 with 211,000 miles on it, the one with the windshield that was finally, 3 months after the new crack appeared, actually going to get replaced this weekend. Because some things you kept intending to get to and eventually you got to them. He drove home. She talked about her soccer team's upcoming game and about the 3rd chapter of the Desert Animals book and about a theory she had about why the math homework got harder when the weather was hot, which he listened to with the attention he always gave her theories, full and without condescension, the attention that said what you notice is worth noticing. They turned into their street. The apartment lights were on from the timer he had set before they left. The night was clear the way desert nights are clear, deep and enormous and full of stars that cities don't allow you to see. He parked the truck. She had already collected her backpack from the back seat and was at the door of the apartment, key out, the particular efficiency of a 9-year-old who knows exactly what the routine is and has long since stopped waiting to be directed through it. He locked the truck. He walked to the door. The night was quiet in the way the desert is quiet, not empty, just wide enough to hold everything in it without pressure or hurry, the cooling engine of the truck clicking in the dark. The stars overhead doing what stars do on a clear October night in the California high desert, which is simply to be there, patient and present, waiting to be seen by anyone who takes the time to look up.